Now that we have access to files, we want to be able to do things like read and write from them. Writing the files is in some ways significantly easier than reading from files, but not in how we do it, just in the logic around doing it. So writing to a file is also done through some helpers. Files, unfortunately though, don't store objects. In Java we build objects. We build strings, we build classes. The classes have some data items, integers and numbers and strings and booleans and all that sort of stuff, arrays. Files are ones and zeros. They match what's on the hard drive. And so I have to find a way of translating from my Java objects into the ones and zeros that are going to be stored in that file. Now, let me tell you, it is possible, and you'll see later on, to write objects to a file. It's not a good idea because objects are a living, breathing thing. Think of it as like medieval text. They're written in English, but they're written in a form of English that's really hard to understand because the language evolved. And so you could not go to a text written in the 1050 and read it like you would read a novel today. You wouldn't understand it as well. Same thing is true with objects. I write it to a file later on. It's possible to read it, but it's probably going to not read properly. It's probably hard that we understand. So I don't do that very often, but it is possible. And you'll actually see that later on, possibly, as we're looking at other options for writing stuff. So that being said, what enables all this stuff is something called Java I/O filtering. Now, a filter takes in one data type and spits out another data type, and it's used on both input and output. So you can think of it this way. If I have a big, dirty vat of water, and I want to have nice, clean water on the other side, I filter it. I run it through sand, I run it through rocks, I run it through maybe man-made filters, whatnot, and then I end up with all the impurities coming out on the other side. So I can take things out of it and turn it into something else. But also, if I want to ship it out to people's houses, I can put stuff into it. I can inject chlorine, I can inject fluoride, I can inject whatever I want to make sure that the extra stuff's clean. So it works both ways. I use the filters when I want to read in data to convert it from ones and zeros to, in our case, we're going to do to characters, and then we'll do characters to lines, and that's how we're going to read in files eventually. And we can also do it for writing stuff. We go from objects into text into ones and zeros. That's what we're going to be heading down here. Now, the beautiful thing about the filtering is we don't really need to deal with this all that much. It's not something that we have to be super hyper aware of. It's something that we are going to use. So there's an implementation, and we're going to work with it. So in our case, we're dealing with files. So we want file input streams and file output streams. And so on the operating system, we have these files out there. When we want to read a file, we use the file input stream, which does some kind of magic that brings data into us. And we want to write to a file, we open a file output stream, which does some kind of magic that writes to objects. Now, the reason why we need to talk about filters, though, is a file input stream and a file output stream only deals at the byte level, ones and zeros. It reads things as bytes, and in Java, the closest you can get to ones and zeros is a byte. Deal with it eight bits at a time, which is very small numbers. The reason for this is because when I deal with files, not every file is a text file. Some files are executables, some files are images. And so I don't want to read something, I don't want to create something that talks to files only as a high-level operation. Think of it this way. If I made a car that only worked for people, and you couldn't take pets inside of it, it wouldn't be a very useful car. If I had to build a car exclusively for pet carriers, but it wasn't good for driving building materials around, it would be a very useful vehicle, right? I build things special later. I add on to them later. I build a basic, you can think of the Transit. There's like some vehicle called Transit. I forget who makes it now. It's like this big boxy van, and it can be big, converted with a bunch of seats. It can be a vehicle for a construction crew. It can be a vehicle for a delivery van. All these sorts of things. But the core of it's the same. It's the same sort of thing here. The file input stream, the file output stream talks to files. It talks to files at a very low level. And so what we do is we use something a little higher level to make it work a little bit better. So when I want to write to a file then, I start off with my file object. It's not even required. You can actually build this along the way, but it's nice since we talked about the file object. and we hand that file object to a file writer. Now, a file writer is different than the file input stream. The file input stream, file output stream, those are ones and zeros. A file writer, and anytime you see the word writer, think text. A stream is ones and zeros, a writer is text. And so Java is really nice because it knows you're going to write text to files quite often. It creates an object to help you write to a file. Just text write to a file. All right, so the file writer gives you a method, as you see here, writer.write. Now, there's limitations to this method. A write method does not write a line to a file, it just writes text to a file. So if you think of a file, line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, you as the writer have to manage the page breaks between line 1, line 2, line 3, and line 4. In Java, it doesn't have a definition of that by default because it depends what operating system it's on. Most operating system, it's a new line character or a carriage return. Some is both. And so you have to be aware of the file format. You have to be aware of what's going on within that. But that's the way we write to a file. Very simply, I create this helper, file writer, from my file, and then I kick it along from there. So the next question comes up. Do you want to write to this file or do you want to append to this file? By default, all files overwrite what was out there to begin with. They're a blackboard. Every time I open a file, I wipe the contents, I write new to it. But I can also add to the end of it. I can treat it like a piece of paper and go bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what appending means, and you're going to be asked to append to your file within the work we're going to be doing for our assignment. Appending to the file is very simple. In a file writer, when I create the file, I hand it the file name, and then I hand it the Boolean value of true to say, yes, I want you to append the file. That means whatever junk is in the file to start with stays there, and I just write to the end of the file. I have to be careful that I write it well, but when I say hello here, I'm going to write hello, then I'm going to write hello again, I'm going to write hello again. That's going to keep appending to the file. Now, as I said, input's going to come later. We're actually going to look at that next week. That's going to be assignment from next week, but the strategy for that is much the same. There's going to be a helper that allows you to read file in. It's important to note now, though, that really, in general, you read from a file or you write to a file. You don't do both at the same time. It's very difficult to do both at the same time. So outside of very specialized file helpers, you're either reading to a file or you're writing to a file.